Meeting to order. Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Duggar.
I am here.
Counselor Hartmeyer-Prigg.
Here.
Counselor Hassan.
Here.
Kimmy.
Here.
Counselor Teeter.
Here.
Counselor Tivnon.
Here.
Mayor Beatty.
Here. Okay, tonight we have a short but intense agenda. We have a few items on consent, a first reading, and then a work session on our fiscal recovery follow-up. So, consent agenda, please.
And Mayor would like to pull item 3.5 from the consent agenda.
Okay.
Make a motion that we approve the consent agenda minus Agenda Bill 2574.
Second.
It's been moved by Counselor Duggar, seconded by Counselor Hassan. Any discussion on tonight's consent? Seeing none, will the recorder call the roll?
Counselor Duggar.
Yes.
Counselor Hartmeyer-Prigg. Yes. Counselor Hassan.
Yes.
Counselor Kimmy.
Yes.
Counselor Teeter.
Yes.
Counselor Tivnon.
Yes.
Mayor Beatty.
Yes. All right, City Manager.
I will have Megan Thornton go over some minor changes that we have to Section D of this policy item.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Council. There are a couple of administrative fixes to the policy before you. So you have in front of you a revised policy that's clean and then also one that shows the red lines. There are two changes. You will see that there's an addition that specifies and make sure that this is consistent with other city policies that expenditures that violate the policy are the responsibility of the city official. And secondly, it clarifies that this is only compensation for purposes of ethics provision in ORS 244040 and not for the purposes of the city charter or the Beaverton Code.
To clarify, because this does not apply to the city charter, it can be applied right away. Is that what you're saying?
No, that is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that this policy is very, very limited to only deal with the ethics issue and only the ethics issue that we are required to define compensation under ORS 244040. We can talk about implementation of the policy at another time, but it's not covered in the policy itself.
Okay. So why did you add that section then? Clarifying that it was specific.
Just to be clear, that there's no requirement that it be defined as compensation under the charter and that this is specific and solely for the purpose of the ethics laws.
I think it makes sense too.
What's the pleasure of the council?
I'll make a motion. Is there an agenda bill? Is it the same one? No, a different one.
It's,
Yeah.
25174.
It is too. Make a motion, we approve the revised permissible expenditure policy as outlined in 25174.
Second.
It's been moved by Counselor Duggar and seconded by Counselor Hassan. Any more discussion on this agenda item? Seeing none, will the recorder call the roll?
Counselor Duggar.
Yes.
Counselor Hartmeyer-Prigg.
Yes.
Counselor Hassan.
Yes.
Counselor Kimmy.
Yes.
Counselor Teeter.
Yes.
Counselor Tivnon.
Yes.
Mayor Beatty.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
The next item on the agenda is the first reading of an ordinance. On November 18th, 2025, during a regularly scheduled city council meeting, a public hearing will be held regarding an ordinance amending the Beaverton Comprehensive Plan land use map to adopt boundaries for Raleigh Hill Town Center and Sunset Town Center, LU 42025-00608 / CPTA 42025-00718. Now, the next item on the agenda is a work session regarding our fiscal recovery follow-up, and that will be led by the city manager, the assistant city manager to our left, and maybe the one banished to the right side of the table. Dealer's choice. Thank you.
Well, Thank you, Mayor. We'll wait to get the slide deck up. And while we're waiting, just a reminder, so as council's aware, we had a work session on September 9th, and we had an opportunity to provide you an update of our fiscal sustainability plan and the work completed to date. Today's a continuation of that conversation. And if we can move to the next slide, I'll just remind you of what we'll be talking about tonight. We'll present you some revenue research, which council directed, along with what we are proposing for the action plan moving forward. Short-term actions specifically we'd like to focus on this evening, along with timeline and next steps for you. Next slide. So there's 4 things that we'd like to accomplish with the council by the end of this meeting. Is one, we'd like you to understand the various tools that you have in your tool belt. We'd like you to consider options for short-term actions, including any type of revenue generation and other strategies that'll help us balance the budget. Of course, we want you to ask questions and last, feedback to help us refine proposals for short-term action, which will come before you in November. And on the next slide is your policy questions. These are going to stem around short-term revenue actions. So we really are looking for direction to refine some of the options that'll be presented to you this evening. Short-term balancing, budget balancing strategies. So really feedback on how we propose to adjust reserve targets. And then also we'll go through a little bit of an exercise with you on service prioritization. You'll also have an opportunity to talk about this more in detail at your upcoming retreat. And then lastly, a medium and short-term plan. We'd like feedback on some proposed actions that you're going to present to you for your consideration, but we do not plan on getting to those all about the short-term actions for right now. So with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Coffey to run you through the revenue research.
All right. Good evening, Mayor and Council. And so bear with me. I have a number of slides to get through tonight. And we're going to start off with revenue research. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the revenue strategies that cities are deploying statewide to address their own financial challenges, because Beaverton is definitely not alone in this challenge. Next slide, please. And so we talked a lot at the September 9th Council work session about how Oregon's Constitution limits the annual growth of assessed property values, which then restricts how much property tax revenue cities like Beaverton can generate. And then that results in a structural deficit because our expenses grow higher than our revenue. And so when you look at 7 similarly sized cities across the state, including Beaverton, Bend, Eugene, Gresham, Hillsborough, Salem, and Medford, what you find is that 6 out of the 7 cities are considering or have passed new revenue to address the impacts of these property tax limitations. And the one that's not currently on the list is Hillsborough, because they have a long-time local levy, and they also have a mix of payers that have an industrial, high industrial value. And so when we do that environmental scan, some of the tools that other cities are using to address their deficits, which range from approximately $6 million to $15 million. They're looking at things like special districts, which we certainly have an abundance of here in Beaverton already. They're considering public safety and transportation fees, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in this presentation. They are indexing their fees to more adequately cover the growth of their expenses. And like Beaverton, they've also used one-time funds to address their deficits. They're also deploying reduction strategies that include things like hiring freezes and FTE reductions. And so next slide, please. So as we looked at what the other 6 similarly sized cities are doing to address their financial challenges, there's 3 clear strategies that emerge that we want to highlight in these slides here. And there's really no right or wrong way to approach how we deal with financial sustainability. And as you'll see, some cities choose to focus on taxes, others focus more on fees, and then most cities focus on a combination of both approaches. And there's going to be pros and cons to each approach. And so we'll start first with a city that's focusing a lot on taxes. And I'll note that you'll see Beaverton here on this slide, and I'm not saying that that's Beaverton's strategy. It's really more of our current state, and our council direction will determine our strategy going forward. And so, but you can see here that in Beaverton, we do have a GO bond for our public safety center. And we do have the property tax rate of approximately $4.78. I would note that that might be a little bit misleading, that because of the various special districts that we have here in Beaverton, the impact to residents is actually much higher than our own property tax rate. So, excuse me, when we look at the city of Eugene, they have really focused on taxes as they've dealt with their financial sustainability plan. So they have 2 levies, one for libraries, one for parks. They have 2 bonds, one for street reconstruction and one for parks capital needs. And together, all told with their permanent rate, their property taxes total $8.21 per 1,000 assessed value. They also have a payroll tax, and we'll talk a little bit about that more later in the presentation. They did adopt that through their city council. It expires in 2028, and then the stated goal is to refer that to voters at that time. And so we'll see what happens with that. And then they do have a small gas tax. Under utility fees, you'll see that they have none with an asterisk. Their city council actually did try to implement a fire services fee in February of 2025, but that did garner some significant community opposition, and the community members were able to gather enough signatures to refer that to the voters. And then at that time, Eugene City Council determined that they would repeal the fee due to the resident opposition, and they're currently working further on their financial sustainability strategies. So the pro to this approach of kind of focusing on taxes is that for the most part, at least when it comes to the levies and the bonds and the gas tax, voters are approving the investments that they're willing to make in city services. So you can assume there's some level of buy-in for what they're paying for. Levies do offer a stable revenue source over 5 years for cities, as does a payroll tax, and provides certainty for residents during that time period as well. The cons would be that it is dependent upon voter approval. And for the levies, the annual growth is limited due to the property tax limitations. At the time that the payroll tax was implemented, they did face significant opposition, so it was a long-term effort to get that up and running. And then there's also not a ready assistance program available for taxes versus fee collection. Next slide, please. So in the city of Medford, they have taken a different approach. They have a permanent rate of $5.29 per 1,000 assessed value. And you can see here on this slide that they have taken the approach of really focusing on fees. And so they have a public safety fee, they have a parks fee, and they have a street maintenance or transportation fee. So all told, per month for single family residents, that totals approximately $32 per month that they collect for fees to provide city services. And the pros to this approach are that it is a highly flexible approach. It can be adjusted anytime that City Council wants to accommodate financial needs or to make different policy decisions. Council can choose to adopt an annual escalator that better reflects the actual growth of expenses. And then cities can choose to offer an assistance program to offset the impact to vulnerable residents. Although when you do that, you do need to fold that into the overall rate package, and it can make the rate slightly higher. The con is that, similar to the pro, it is highly flexible, and so these are fees that can be repealed anytime by council. And so when elected bodies change, and if they have different policy perspectives, they could choose to take a different path, and that can lead to some instability in the revenue system. Fees do need to have a legal nexus in terms of what they're being collected for and how they're collected. And they can, as we saw in the city of Eugene, they can be referred by voters if they're not popular and voters feel like they want to be able to vote on them. Next slide, please.
Maybe a little unorthodox, but we have some questions, and it's hard for me in this capacity when we use these, because that's how I know if there's questions from the council, but go ahead, Councilor Hartmeyer-Prigg.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I was just curious on the payroll tax, and it's like half a penny or whatever on Eugene. Sorry, on the slide before.
Okay.
How do you even assess? Like, is that like they get half a penny per paycheck from the city? You know, like I don't understand how it would work from a city implementation.
Yeah, I'm not real familiar with the mechanism of what it's assessed on. I know that it's assessed, through the employer and they collect it from the employee paychecks, but I think you'll see later on that at this moment we weren't recommending that as a potential tool to move forward. So I'll have to admit I haven't researched that in too much detail yet.
Thank you.
Okay. And so then most of the other 6 cities focus on a combination of taxes and fees. And so you can see here that Bend has a levy and a bond and a transportation utility fee. Gresham has a levy for police and fire, and then a fee for public safety and parks. Hillsborough has a police, fire, and parks levy and a transportation utility fee. And Salem has a levy that recently passed for libraries, parks, recreation, and their senior center, as well as a bond. And then they have a city operations fee for general city services. And so you can see it's a little bit all over the map in terms of the property tax rate and then the fees that are collected by these jurisdictions. And so the pros of this approach is that, generally speaking, a diverse set of revenue tools is going to provide a healthier financial system because if one tool fails, you have a backup tool, and it does kind of spread the impact a little bit across various customer types. The cons can be that there is, potential resident backlash over numerous revenue tools, and so it can require some additional outreach and education to explain why that's needed. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about various revenue tool options. And so at the last council work session, there was a desire to discuss some of the various revenue tools that are being used in a little bit more detail. And I would say that there's a number of different revenue tools that are out there. And so what we focused on is what are the ones that are most commonly being used by jurisdictions across the state to address their deficit situations. And what we are doing here is categorizing them by most viable for the short term. And so these would be things that are within the city's authority that could potentially generate income within 1 to 2 years of implementation. We have also categorized them by maybe we might want to consider them for the medium or long term. And so medium term are ones that are also within the city authority that could be generating revenue within 2 to 5 years. And then long-term ones are also ones that currently are beyond city authority. And so these are things that might require substantial changes to state law or actions by other governmental entities. And then we've also noted a category of revenue options that they're not recommended for consideration at this time. And so we'll talk a little bit through each of these tools, starting with the next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about local option levies at the last council work session regarding financial sustainability. That is one that is on the council's financial sustainability action plan at the moment. And so this is, as a reminder, an additional 5-year property tax for operating expenses. This is compatible with the city's budget needs. It has the potential to generate moderate to high revenue, and it does provide stability for 5 years that it's in effect. Who pays? That's property owners. And the administrative ease Most of the work is really going into the development of the measure, the communications and outreach campaign. The implementation itself is fairly straightforward as the county collects property taxes. And so the timeline, 2026 options as an example, a May 2026 vote, we would receive funding in November of 2026. For a November 26 vote, we would receive funding in November of 2027. And the council would refer this for public vote.
So in this scenario, if we waited until November, we would have a one-year funding gap in which we would still have to make reductions even when voters are voting to move it forward. So the difference between May and November is an entire year of funding.
That's correct. And I would also note that when we look at November of 2026, or for example, May of 2027, in terms of when we receive the revenue, no difference, right? And so the difference would be more, what's the right timing politically for the measure. Next slide, please. The other revenue tool that we identified as most viable, probably no surprise given the slides we just looked at, is some sort of monthly service fee. And so I'm going to spend a little more time talking about this fee because we haven't talked about that much with council. This is a fee established for city services and collected on the utility bill. And the reason that it's collected on the utility bill is that it's a bill that's already in existence. So it really streamlines our ability to collect. We already have that collection mechanism. We don't have to purchase a new billing software. We don't have to hire additional staff to set up a whole new collection mechanism like we would for a tax, for example. Cities have used these for, as you just saw, for transportation, public safety, general city services, and even for things like streetlight replacement. This does have, and I would mention also that the structure really varies. And that'll be a key policy decision if we decide to pursue this. So some cities have flat fees that are the same across customer types. So whether you're a large business or a small business or a single family homeowner or a multifamily, it could be the same fee. Other cities have chosen to tier the fees by customer class so that, for example, a single family might pay a different fee than multifamily, et cetera. And sometimes they are scaled by the size of the development. So the larger the development, the larger the fee. I would also note too that there's something to be considered in terms of that nexus to service and being able to justify why you're structuring the fee the way you're structuring it. And so, for example, for our transportation utility fee that we've been discussing, that really relies on the number of trips and uses that as a calculation to determine the fee. And then that fee considers residential customers as a single unit, multiplies that fee by that. But then for commercial, looks at the number of employees to determine the units and multiplies it by that. So all very long way to say there's a variety of different ways you can structure the revenue, and that's a key policy decision. I would also note that the timeline that you see here on the screen is really dependent upon what structure we go with. If we are going to go with a structure where we can use data that we already collect through our current utility billing system, like the size of the meter or the number of sewer hookups, that is a relatively straightforward timeline, 6 months to a year, to research the policy options and provide those to council, go through the communications and outreach, et cetera. If we decided to go a different direction and we needed to collect data that we don't currently have, then that is not that it's not impossible. It's just it would take longer for us to actually go out, collect that data, and adjust our billing system accordingly. And so in terms of who pays this particular fee, all utility customers would pay. We do have an existing assistance program that's available for low-income residents. And then council has the ability to adopt this via ordinance and resolution. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in this presentation too. Moving on to medium and long-term options. Lots of cities are looking at franchise fees and licenses. And those are fees on utility service providers who are utilizing the city's right-of-way. Often those are passed on to the customers, and so customers might see something on their electricity bill that says, City of Beaverton fee. And that can have potentially a moderate impact on the city's financial situation. We charge about 5% right now for those, and so for every 1% increase, it would be roughly $1 million. And so as mentioned, this is technically assessed to utility providers, but it is passed on to utility customers. It's relatively straightforward to administer. We already have this in place, and it would just be an increase. And the timeline, therefore, is pretty short to implement it, but potentially needing more time for outreach and also to consider the impact on residents as well. This is something that council has authority to adopt directly. Next slide, please. The other tool to consider in the medium term is the transient lodging tax. This is a tax on overnight lodging, as you know. Our TLT is 4%. So it has a fairly moderate revenue potential. As an example, a 1% increase is approximately $400,000. It's paid by visitors staying and lodging. Pretty straightforward from an administrative perspective. I'll note under the timeline that currently we have funds that are being used in part to pay for some bonds that were issued in 2020 for the construction of the Reeser, and that bond will be paid off in 2040. So that's just a piece of data for you to know and consider. I would also add that per state law, 70% of TLT funds need to go to tourist promotion, and we can spend up to 30% towards the general fund.
Word tax here used loosely. Trying to split the difference between tax versus a fee, and this one seems to question mark.
But the hoteliers put it as a tax. They don't put it as a fee. It's their language. That's when we adopted it the first time.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Can you tell me why this is medium term, and if it's easy to implement and we generates 400,000? It seems like it maybe should fit into short term unless I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we can talk about and consider moving forward. I mean, there's a certain staggering out of some of the revenue tools, also just from a staff workload perspective as well. But if it's this is one of the reasons we wanted to bring this to council today, right? To see, do we have these categorized correctly? Is this in the right spot? If there's something that folks want to move up or want to postpone, we can certainly have that discussion today. And then, again, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but council has the authority to adopt this via ordinance. So moving on to the next slide, please. So there are revenue tools other cities are considering or have implemented that we're not recommending at this time. And generally, the reason for that could be that there might not be significant revenue raising opportunity. It could also be that administration might be costly and difficult or time consuming to set up and kind of eat into the revenue that's being raised. And we might also anticipate significant opposition to the implementation. And so I would say just because we're not recommending them at this particular moment in time, subject to council direction, doesn't mean that we wouldn't consider them at some point in the future. We're just looking at the deficit situation that we're in now and what tools are most appropriate to address that. And so lots of cities have general obligation bonds. Beaverton is no exception to that. And we're not recommending that for this particular deficit because it is appropriate for capital and not for operations. But that's a great example of something that we may consider down the road. Payroll tax is, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that tax that's based on wages. We're not recommending that at this time due to the significant administrative cost and time to implement. So unlike income taxes, payroll taxes are withheld by employers from employees' paychecks and then remitted to local governments. They can fund various local services, but they have faced significant opposition elsewhere in the state. I know that Salem did try to implement that and was voted down. And so if we did pursue, I would suggest it would be in the medium term bucket due to this need for significant outreach and time to really develop a new collections program. The other tool that we're not recommending at this time is the targeted sales tax. And so cities can impose a targeted sales tax for specific goods or services. This could be also things like admissions to theater or concert events. And so these taxes often focus on items that capture significant contributions from tourists and non-residents. So as an example, tourist destinations like the city of Ashland and Cannon Beach both have a 5% tax on all prepared food and beverages, including foods sold by restaurants. At one time, the city of Eugene had identified this as a potential tool as well as an admissions tax, but they haven't moved forward with either of those options yet. We haven't recommended this at this time, primarily because of concerns about the impacts that this could have on our economic development efforts and our local business community. But I would know that it would also require, again, significant administration costs to set up a tax collection program. One thing that a couple of other jurisdictions are also pursuing potentially long-term are payments in lieu of taxes. And so that is a payment that's made by a tax-exempt entity like a government or a nonprofit organization to a city to compensate them for some of the cost of providing municipal services to that community. And so these payments could be mandated through legislation, but they're usually voluntary agreements between the jurisdiction and the organization. And so when you look at the City of Eugene and Salem's long-term revenue reports, those are tools that they have identified long-term interest in pursuing. And so I would note one key reason that we are not recommending this option at this time is what is different about Salem and Eugene is that they already have multiple revenue tools in place that they've established to help address their deficit situation. And then, the makeup of those cities is a little bit different as well. And so an effort like this would really take several years to implement. Due to either having to get it legislated or having voluntary agreements. So moving on to the next slide. So now we're going to talk through some potential adjustments to the Fiscal Sustainability Action Plan. Next slide, please. And the reason that we're talking about that is that significant progress has been made on the current Fiscal Sustainability Action Plan. And so as we talked about at the last council work session, I want to highlight again that we've made $9 million in expense reductions over the last couple of years. We've reduced 32 FTE positions. Property taxes have been raised to the full capacity, and the fee study has been completed. And really the key things that have not been done but are in progress is really exploring additional revenue tools. And so, exploring a future local option levy or a fee, and then exploring that transportation utility fee. Next slide, please. So our recommendation as we think about the plan going forward, would like to recommend that we think about things with that short-term, medium-term, and long-term lens. It kind of helps organize and prioritize the work that we're doing. So we would recommend updating the plan with new actions for each of those categories and really focus a lot on the short term, as Jenny mentioned today. That's what we'll spend most of our time talking about. And then would recommend that the plan really is intended to be a living document to be able to respond to changing circumstances or changing policy direction. So we do want to review and update that plan annually. Next slide, please. So here is our proposal pending council feedback today. And so for the short term, as I mentioned, we do have discussions around the transportation utility fee are in progress. We will embark on a business license fee study later this year and report back to council on the findings on that. We are in the middle of a soft hiring freeze where we're being intentional about the positions that we fill. And then we want to discuss today a potential local option levy and/or some sort of monthly fee. And then we also do want to discuss some budget balancing strategies, which would include service prioritization and our reserve targets. On the medium-term list, we have consider transient lodging tax increase, as well as a franchise fee increase. We'd suggest a library fund focus, given recent discussions around library funding have highlighted the need for long-term solutions for that program. And then we would like to look at healthcare designs and future cost-sharing options. For the long term, of course, we're always interested in property tax reform. I know that's ongoing work. And then there was a suggestion at the last council work session to consider insurance pooling, and we'd love to look into that long term as well. So we're going to hone in now on short-term actions, and we'll start with some revenue options. Next slide, please. And so what I'd like to focus in on these next couple slides is really give council an idea of the policy decisions that would be in front of you for each revenue tool that you might pursue, so that you have an idea of what work you have kind of on your plate. And then we'll also go a little bit over what the next steps are from a staff perspective, so that you have an idea of the work that it would take to kind of come back to you with more information. And again, we're not asking for a decision today. We're just looking to check in to see what options you're interested in pursuing and refining further. So for the local option levy, the policy decisions, there's a couple policy decisions around timing. If we want to go for a May or November levy, we'd want to think about, are we going to go out in 2026 or 2027 or beyond? We will eventually want to have some discussions around the amount of the levy that we want to go out for. And then the scope, what's going to be covered in the levy, what is that going to be paying for? If we do pursue a levy, the next steps would be to really refine our message and do some voter engagement to continue to assess where we're at. We do need to do some updated financial analysis. We have property tax data that's coming in November, and then we do need to create a more refined model for exact costing of what the levy would be covering over the next 5 years. And overlay that with our general fund forecast. So some work to do around financial analysis. And then we'd also want to really hone in on exactly what services are preserved through the potential passage of a levy. And then I want to make a note about developing that communications and engagement plan. Regardless of whatever direction we receive tonight, we are hard at work on developing a communications and engagement plan around the value of city services and our financial sustainability work in general. And so that work will be proceeding regardless. And so just wanted to provide some reassurance on that. But of course, if we were to pursue a local option levy, we'd need to develop a specific communication engagement plan around the levy itself. Next slide, please. Okay, monthly fee policy decisions, not too dissimilar from the levy. We'd want to think about the timing. When might the fee be effective and when might you want to implement it? We'd want to pick a revenue target, or conversely, you can focus more on the monthly impact to residents and kind of pick some targets around that. And then, as I mentioned, there's lots of different structure options, and so that's a really key policy decision for council is how you want it to be structured and what impact it might have on various customer types. And then we do have an assistance program. Council could choose to invest more funds in that as part of the fee modeling as well. And then we'd want to determine what purpose we want the fee to be for. The most common purpose across the cities we've looked at is public safety, and then a couple have general city services. So if we were to pursue developing the fee further, the key next step would really be to work with a consultant to research fee structures and develop per month impacts for each structure that we study, and then come back to council in probably a couple different work sessions to give you the opportunity to discuss and ask questions. Of course, we'd want to develop and implement a communications and engagement plan, and then after the research and work sessions are done, present for adoption, and then adjust our billing system. Next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to give you some examples of how these decisions could play out. And I want to heavily caveat this slide that this is a very simplistic back of the napkin example. We did this just in-house using some pretty general assumptions. And so don't get too attached to these numbers, I guess, is what I would like you to take away from this slide. It's really more to just provide you a sense of scale and what might be possible. And I think one thing to really take away from this slide is that I think what it shows you is that there's definitely possibilities in all three of these approaches. And so, we can make it work through these various approaches. And what's important to consider is really just the impact on residents and the policy decisions that you want to make. So, and then also, you'll see at the bottom of the slide a little asterisk, and that's just a reminder that a transportation utility fee, if adopted, would be an additional utility fee. So keep that in mind as you're looking at the monthly residential impact. You can go ahead and kind of add on a potential TUF to these figures. I think it's important to think through the total impact moving forward. And so for the purposes of this hypothetical example, we are assuming an approximately $10 million deficit. And so as an example, if you had a local option levy and we targeted $10 million, that would be about 76 cents per thousand with a monthly residential impact of $17.51 for the average single-family homeowner in Beaverton. If we had a monthly fee only, that's a little bit more difficult to estimate because the various structures, really the revenue that's brought in will vary substantially. But if we had a $10 million target, depending on the structure, you could see anywhere from $16 to $35.50 per month. And so that is one option. If we had both a levy and the fee, just for the purposes of easy math, we assumed that the levy would bring in $5 million and the fee would also. And so a levy bringing in $5 million would be about 38 cents per thousand assessed value, with an $8.77 a month impact to the average single-family homeowner. And then the fee, again, depending on the structure, could be between $8 and $17.75. So you can note that all options end up about the same on the low end of the structure. Next slide, please. Okay, moving away from revenue and talking through budget balancing. One thing that we wanted to talk about today are our reserve targets. And so Beaverton has a reserve policy that sets targets that are to guide our budget development. And so right now, our targets are that we are to have 11% of our general fund operating expenses set aside into reserve at the time of budget development. And then by the end of the fiscal year, we are to have 17% set aside in that reserve in total. And the reason that we have these two targets can be a little confusing, but the reason for that is that generally speaking, the industry best practice is to have about 2 months total in reserves. And 2 months is almost 17%. And so by only having 11% in the reserve fund at budget time, that provides more flexibility for budgeting and service preservation. But 17% at the end of the year captures some of the underspend that naturally occurs. So it's a way to meet that target. But I'm going to pause because I see that Councilor Duggar has a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about reserve targets, but also just budget processing. years before I was on the council, I was on the budget committee. How do reserve targets change if we go to like a 2 year? I think we really need to consider that. Or that we put in to put together a document and a process. I just don't know that we receive a whole lot of value of doing it annually versus like a 2 year cycle, like some of the cities that are actually included in this study have moved towards. So like, how would that change our discussion on reserve targets? Or if you don't know that, it's okay.
Yeah, and I don't know, and Susan, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'll take a stab at it, and she can. I mean, what I would say about biennial budgets is one of the things that's difficult about a city that in our financial situation about switching to a biennial budget is that we are already struggling to balance the budget on an annual basis. And so just my professional perspective is that it would be better to look at that when we're a little bit more stable, because I think, adding in the 2 year span makes it all the more difficult to budget over that span. But Susan, I will turn it over to you if you would like to answer that question.
Yeah, so good evening, Susan Cole, Assistant Finance Director. So the specific question about reserve and biennial budgeting, actually it would not change because under our audit and accounting and our Government Finance Officer Association, we're still required to report annually. And so those reserve targets, 2 months worth of annual operating is the 17%. So that would be the industry standard that we internally would measure each fiscal year end, irrespective of our budgeting period.
Even though fiscal year kind of ending where we carry over money would be different on a 2 year versus a single, because that's kind of where my brain was going, is like that carryover money would impact things differently, because in theory you would just carry it over.
Correct. There is a carryover. The challenge is how this is really wonky, but how accounting works is it looks at the June 30th fiscal year end, not counting that carryover. That carryover would go into the following year and could help that following year's reserve target, if that makes sense. But it's still at fiscal year end, it's still 2 months. So if we have extra in the first year, let's say that we carry over, it just helps meet that second year target.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And the reason I just wanted to make sure, like, as we were thinking about reserve targets, and because I really want to push for a 2 year budget cycle at some point, that we're not setting a target and then having to go and revise it the moment we do something else. So thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple questions about the reserve slide. So as I read this, if it's kind of best practice to have 2 months, and ours would lead us to 16.6, but we actually set ours at 11. So we're lower maybe than we would recommend.
So we do 11% at budget, and then at the end of the fiscal year, we have to have 17% if we want to meet the target. And so that's a way for us, there's typically some level of underspend that occurs, and that's a way for us to capture that underspend. It gets put in our reserve policy. So at the end of the fiscal year, we are in compliance with the best practices.
And so the recommendation of temporarily decrease the targets by 1%, that would mean that at the end of the year, we'd want 16. Is that where the reduction, like you put it at the tail end?
Yeah, I mean, you could do either or both. And so one of the reasons that we're recommending that is that we're in a period where we're trying to get more financially stable. And so there's a balance between, we want to, of course, remain fiscally responsible and make sure that our reserves are healthy. But we are also trying at a certain point to try to preserve some of our services, because we know that sometimes bringing online these new revenue tools takes time. And so it could be an option to temporarily decrease those targets instead of reducing some services.
Okay. And I think that if we come to consensus on that temporary reduction, I think I would like for us to build in the reinstatement timeline because of like what happened with our street fund, right? And actually like put it in proactively of when that change would be undone.
Well, and I would just say from the past council that set the reserve budget, it was much higher than 11 when Mark Sansucci and Mark Fagan, and then part of our reduction strategy over the years was to reduce it to 11. So we had started at a much higher amount, and one of the main reasons the past city council did that was we're sitting in a building that we were able to purchase because we had significant revenue on hand for major projects, and so the council set the reserve thing much higher. So we've already been adjusting as a council. This isn't new for this elected body. I don't think I've ever looked at it this way.
Yeah, okay. And then this question, I feel silly for asking, but I don't understand the difference between operating expenses and operating budget as like your baseline for determining your reserves. Can you help me understand?
Yeah, so some people use their operating, actuals, and so they might look at what their actuals were for the previous fiscal year, and then some people will use their operating budget. And so the operating budget is going to be a little bit more conservative, right? Because we're going to assume that all of our positions are filled 100% of the year, right? For example. And so, and then sometimes it's also just administratively easier to look at the operating budget because that's what you're setting at that moment in time. So it's just a policy decision that folks can make.
Okay. Do you have any insight into why Gresham's is set at 5% and how long it's been like that?
Yes, it's been that way as long as I have been there. So I was there for 9 years, and it's at 5%. And the reason for that is because of their financial situation. And so Gresham has been kind of teetering on the edge of the fiscal cliff for a long time. And they just did not have the funds to have more money in their reserves. And that was the choice that they made, was to they chose to preserve services and not have as much in their reserves, which there are pros and cons to that approach, right? And they are actually in the middle of revising this policy because it's long been acknowledged it really is not meeting best practice or sufficient, and they haven't quite yet decided what they're going to do yet. So this is their current policy. I'm not quite sure what they're going to change it to. They have talked about, I think, doing some aspirational targets because they like the idea of maybe maintaining that flexibility if times are tough again.
Okay. And then a follow-up on something stated from the mayor that first time that the council has looked at decreasing this is the language around temporary decrease. What does that mean? Is it something that's revisited every year? Because I haven't heard this mentioned during the budget conversations before about the other decreases that were made, if those were considered temporary. So how does this circle back to council, to the budget committee? Get amnesia about this.
Yeah, I think that this would be a decision that you could make during the budget process. And so, it's part of your reserve policy. It sets a target that is supposed to guide budget development specifically, right? And so it seems appropriate that you would be considering this during the budget process, and then it can be an annual discussion.
Can I just also don't want to eclipse this moment without pointing out, if any of you guys are thinking of suggesting that our services drop to 5%, that Gresham's base taxes is almost $1 per 1,000 lower than ours, and they have fire and parks wrapped in. So our base revenue is much higher than theirs. So just in case any of you guys are thinking that's the easy button we're going to smash here, she's a lot more polite than I. Sir Kimmy?
Hi, can you explain to me one more time why you're asking us to decrease the target budget by 1%?
Sure. So this is a potential recommendation for you to consider. And as we're looking at potential options to work towards financial sustainability, one of the issues that cities tend to face is that revenue tools can take a long time to get in place. So let's say, for example, the council decided to go out for a levy in May of 2026. And let's just say, I'm sure this wouldn't happen, but let's just say it failed. And then you're faced with going out again in November, and you're going to have a long delay. And so temporarily decreasing the target in that situation acknowledges the fact that you are working on bringing in new revenue, and it is taking you longer than expected. And so rather than making the decision to, let's say, eliminate $1 million in services, you are making the decision to temporarily not meet those reserve targets. And so that's one way to look at it, is really trying to determine, is this something that we want to do temporarily while we're working on getting to a more financially stable place?
So you're basing this on maybe the levy and fee question, if and if not pass, operating the same level of services?
Potentially, right? And this is just a recommendation that ultimately would come back to council during the budget process. And so it is a tool that you have in your toolbox that you can use to try to balance the budget.
Yeah, because I would be hesitant to decrease the target budget without addressing operational reductions or cost-saving measures implemented. So that's my comment.
Councilor Hartmeyer-Prague.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, reserve is funding that we do not allocate in the budget. So it's just money that is set aside. And so by reducing it by 1%, right, then we have a little bit more that we could allocate through our budget process. And I think that like the 1% is a very small recommendation, right? So that we still have a really solid baseline in that reserve. But that it gives us that chance to, we have a little bit more, right? You have a little bit more to work with. Is that the right understanding?
Correct. That is the rationale behind us bringing that forward for consideration. Okay, if there's no other questions on this slide, I'll move on to the next slide, please. And I'm almost at the end. Thank you for hanging in there with me. So as we mentioned, over the last few years, 32 staff positions have been eliminated. And going forward, further reductions really will have a noticeable impacts on our service delivery. And for some areas, we may need to have some hard conversations about whether that's a service that we can continue to offer given staffing levels. And so to aid council in providing input on our service delivery options, we were thinking that we could take the work that we started in April to do a general fund program inventory and further refine that work. And we could come back to you with more detail around that general fund inventory and categorize the services so that you have a deeper understanding of the services that we offer. So we could really look at and provide you information about services and indicate whether or not they're a direct service to the community. We could indicate this is a service that is an indirect service provided by departments. We could indicate whether there's a mandate or whether the service provides administrative support for mandated services, whether it's discretionary, and whether there is any revenue that either covers the cost or partially covers the cost. Then we could really work on developing a framework for council to consider when we talk about the services that we offer, and we could look at impact, we could look at how many residents this reaches. If it's an internal service, we could look at whether it's relied upon by one department or multiple. We could also consider the baseline level of the service. So is this so leanly staffed that further reductions mean that we need to think about whether we can offer it? Or could it be reduced? And if so, what would the impact be? We could also consider the cost of the service, and then, of course, council and community priorities. And so we wanted to check in with council to see if this is something that seems like it would be useful. And if so, then we would go back to our department head team and work on creating this report for council. And with that, I believe I'm turning it over to Jenny for the next slide.
All right, well, we're almost over the goal line. If we can get to the next slide. This is a timeline that assumes a May levy. And as you can see, starting out over the next 3 months, There would be a levy development underway, fee development underway as well. Moving into January, we would want to develop a statement and a ballot measure. Council would need to vote then on that measure. We would continue to have fee work sessions, as Elizabeth said. There's some structure policy issues that you need to weigh in on. And then moving into the spring, that deadline to file a ballot measure occurs in March. And then we have a fee adoption that would need to occur, plus there's outreach that would be tied into that. Kind of coming to May and June, of course, there's a renewal that is occurring, and then the potential levy could be scheduled. And then depending on what council's outreach there. And then if you'll notice, in the box below, there's a parallel process. We've got the budget that's happening all throughout that time. So we've got the proposed budgets finalized in April, and then we bring that to the budget committee final adoption in June. And this could have a potential fee implementation that we have to talk about, whether that makes sense. And then, as Elizabeth said, we would not receive revenue, obviously, until November, which is the better alternative than if we went next year, because then we're delayed a year. This is just kind of food for thought. And then the overlay that you don't see here is obviously campaign framework, which is developed now, but that would also need to be set up if we are going to be focusing on levy. So with that, on the last slide here, these are the policy questions that I talked to you about in the beginning. And so really think about the short-term revenue options that seem to appeal to you, and ask questions that you've done during the discussion. We really are interested in hearing your feedback so we can get some direction on the reserve targets. That's important for me because I'll bring budget to you that takes whatever direction you give to me tonight in consideration, and then any feedback that you have in the prioritization. And as I mentioned, and then having a more conversation, develop some of that framework that Elizabeth was talking about on the medium and short. Up a little bit, and that could be considered in the budget development process as well. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Councillor Tivnon. All right, Councillor Hartmeyer-Prague.
Still have more. Thank you. I have a couple of questions on the revenue options. So for the local option levy, like early in the presentation, it said property owners, but then a little bit later you said homeowners. And I wanted to ask, does the levy apply to all types of properties that are owned, or is it only homeowners?
Yes, that's correct. It is all property owners, but I was focusing on the monthly impact on homeowners.
Okay, thank you. And then if we do a levy, since it's on assessed value, as assessed value goes up incrementally, does that apply to a levy as well?
Correct, but the growth is capped at 3% per year.
Okay. And then a question on the service fee, where we mentioned the low income assistance program. Do we essentially do that by reducing the projected revenue, or do you have to set aside money to pay for that program?
So we do have money set aside to fund the program, and so typically, if you were going to increase it and you had a new revenue source coming in, you might consider building that into the revenue structure. But cities can also choose to subsidize the assistance program out of their funds if they have funds available. So it can be either or.
Okay. I think that's it.
Councillor Tivnon.
Okay. As we're thinking about communicating this out to the public, if a levy were passed, or a mixture of fee and levy passed, not including the transportation fee conversation, the graphs look different in terms of our expenses and revenue in a way where we start to see coming back together? Or is this still just short-term? And I ask this, and what are we assuring the public of when it comes time to communications plan?
I think it depends on the revenue solution and the structure, right? And so I think, for example, if you have a fee and you choose to set an escalator that more closely matches the growth of our expenses, then yes, like you would see those two lines start to converge. I think with a property tax levy, typically you do see the lines converge, right? Particularly in the beginning years. And then typically what you see is like towards the end of the life of the levy, you see the graph maybe start to widen again, right? And that's typically why jurisdictions will often have to increase the levy when they go out for renewal. So, there isn't a permanent fix, right, until we are able to really fix the system we're in. But, if you consider the 5-year life of a levy to be long-term, then yes, you will see improvements in that graph.
Are we giving our thoughts? When going back to that slide that had the different scenarios of levy, and fee, looking at the numbers associated with both of those, my inclination for other counselors are thinking is to do a blend. I think for one, the communication around the levy, it's competing. And I think that might ease things up a little bit in making the arguments, but also with knowing that the fees are much easier to implement and streamlined in terms of collection. It just seems like having a little bit of both is something that I'm feeling more interested in exploring, but also want to hear more about the fact that future councils could decide to rescind a fee, or that exactly what kind of insight we can have to know what's the risks we're taking on if we do go.
Well, I would just say that in the event that Measure 5 and 50 were adjusted at the state and revenues were changed, that would be when you would reduce a fee. I can't imagine a future council under the budget constraints we're on being like, no more money for us, give it back. I mean, all things are possible, but I also think, the 76 per thousand in the operating fee isn't really even addressing our total budget. And I would say if we look at historic levies that have been passed, a levy that high would be incredibly difficult to accomplish. Councillor Husson?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'm going to take us to the Wayback Machine for a minute when we started the Fiscal Sustainability Committee with Councillor Duggar and Mayor Beatty. I remember calling in from Australia and making sure we made all the right decisions, and I think we were having a hard time with the conversation, and I think we're going to continue to have a hard time with the conversation. I am hesitant to do fee and levy. That feels like a lot to throw at people. I feel like it's my gut feeling right now, so that makes me nervous. I spent some time with you all last night watching the meeting that I missed, so I feel really like up to date on what you all talked about. From that meeting and today, I'm just looking at the appetite of the community around levies, and it just feels not great. And I would be lying if I said that I just want to say that out loud. Most of what my comments, I think, should not be new to folks, so I'll just kind of say it out loud. I think the appetite of the community is going to be difficult with levy, so personally I'm leaning towards fee, but I want to continue to have a conversation. The general fund is mostly tied to police, and I've talked about what does it look like for us to understand what our police are doing and making sure that we build better systems around public safety. So what does a study look like to say, these are the needs that our officers are dealing with, some that are police needs and some that are housing, for example. So I've said that, probably quite a bit. I know that there's been a conversation just about understanding more about the municipal court. So just want to make sure, I know that was something we'd kind of talked about in fiscal sustainability, and if I missed something that happened, please let me know. The other piece I think is management to staff ratio. We've talked about this, I've probably talked about this more in my one-on-ones, just, I think I talked, because I feel more, I've been in this change for longer. I know I hear from folks who feel like the city has maybe become more top-heavy than in the community. I think that's wrong, but I'd like to get more data around that so that I can communicate that. So, what is our sort of folks out there doing the work to management ratio has been on my mind. Because I just watched the meeting last night, I just want to put this out there. Like, I support the TLT moving of the TLT and increasing that. I know Councilor Teeter brought that up last time. Councilor Kimmy also had brought up some ideas around shared services, which I was also very interested in. I acknowledge that that is probably a very big lift, but I just want to make sure I put it out there. Okay, I'm going to go to these other questions. I support the reserve target move. I think it's fine. I understand the hesitation from some folks, but I support it. When I talk about service prioritization, I do like what you're saying about the general fund. But again, I feel like I need more information about what our officers are doing on the street and like what is something that they should be doing versus what is something that our homeless services liaison should be doing, and trying to better build something around that response. The medium and long-term plans, I think, were just taxes, correct? TLT, I think that was it. Yep, TLT, consider franchise fee increase. Love it. Can you just elaborate really quickly for me on healthcare design update so that I know what that is, please?
Yes, so I think we know that the cost of our personnel is an issue, right? And we have a generous benefits package. One thing that we could consider is looking at how our healthcare package is designed. We could look at changing the deductible amount to see if that might get us a lower cost, or at least minimize the increase. We could also consider some sort of future cost sharing with employees. And so those are kind of the things that don't have a ton of detail on that, because it's not work that we're pursuing in detail right at this time, but it could be something that we consider to kind of contain some of our cost increases.
Okay. My last comment, and I've said this probably more in my one-on-ones than publicly, I worry about putting this on people's election too, during their election. Like, I do have some empathy around like having run for office and then also trying to pass a thing. So there's a little bit of concern I have around asking folks to do too much. So those are my initial thoughts. Thanks.
Councilor Teeter.
Thank you. This was a very thorough data and presentation, so I really appreciate that. Coming into this, I was definitely leaning more towards I want to be aggressive with pursuing primarily levy and prioritizing less on the fee side of things. But I think just being realistic, and Councilor Tivnan and Mayor Beatty's comments about having more of a blend of it, I could see that working because it might make a levy more feasible for us to actually pass. I do think we want a levy. I do want to pursue a levy. My election is in May, and I'm planning to run for re-election. I would be more than happy to support a levy being on the ballot in May. I know that would be a lot of work. I know it's a lot of work for the city to help or to plan that all out over the next 6 months. But I think we need the revenue. And I think the urgency, especially given the federal circumstances that we're in, I think the urgency is there, the story is there, where we can say, Beaverton is sometimes on our own here, and the federal government's not supporting us like it could. I think there's some good storytelling and some good messaging we could do for a levy in May. I think I would like the more advanced timeline there. I would be interested in moving TLT up to the shorter time frame. I think if I'm thinking about adding a levy, we're already planning the transportation utility fee, potentially some other fee too. It puts more urgency on having a TLT increase for me, even though it might be $400,000 for 1% increase. That's part of the storytelling for me. If I'm going out to voters and saying why they should support a levy, I want to also say it's not just locals who are bearing this cost. And I think that's one of the driving reasons why I want to advance that a little bit. And then I would support having the option to temporarily reduce our reserves target. I think that was really creative. I think the focus on temporary is really good because we don't know what will happen if we pursue a levy. And I think the flexibility of just saying, all right, we just need something to carry us over for a year or maybe two while we work something out. I think that could help reduce the burden we feel as we're really planning all this out. And then long-term, definitely support property tax reform at the state level. I would love if that wasn't long-term, but that is just the reality of it. So I appreciate the work that went into this, and I think we got some good options moving forward, but definitely a blend of a levy and fees for me.
Councilor Duggar.
Thanks for all this, as always. I'll start with service prioritization. There's some additional criteria I think we need to think about. One of them is we're in the land of special districts, and if our special districts are providing a service, I would like us to look at that, as maybe us not having to provide that service as well. And maybe that's just not the case. Maybe that's not good. But I think if our residents are paying for it from another jurisdiction, I want us to put that on there as like a consideration. Also, are there services we are offering that our peer cities are not? That's going to be pretty clear to me. Not a basic service. Now, obviously, it's not that simple, but I would like to see that highlighted as a potential thing. For short-term revenue options, I'm going to be the third or fourth person to say TLT should be higher, but I'm going to go a little further and say I think franchise fees, we should look at that. And if we can't do it in the next year, then it should be closer to year 2 than year 5 on our medium term. I would like to see what other peer cities are doing with that. And to be frank, like as far as utilities and things like that go and all these fees, those are just lines on a number that I pay. And I think it would be less mentally impactful for people, for us. So I think I'd like to see us look at that. I'm not saying we have to move it to short term, but closer to that 2-year than that 5-year. I think we've got to really look at that. I do support a mix of fees and the operating levy. I think about, in my perspective as being on this council almost, I'm coming up on my 4th year next year. I think about future councils, and that fee gives them flexibility, and that gives them future colleagues or future replacements of me and us more tools in the belt to solve the problems that they're going to face that we did not have available to us now. And I think part of our legacy has to be, not only do we make our budgets better and things like that, but do we give tools to our future elected officials to solve whatever problem might be coming to them. And so I really like the idea of a mix of both a levy, because that also allows us to lower the levy. If we institute a public service or a public safety fee or something like that, I think you would have asked me at the beginning of the meeting, I was leaning a different direction. So I like that's playing well in my head. Adjustments to reserve funds that make me really uncomfortable. I'm not saying no. I'm saying that in very specific situations, such as like what the mayor mentioned about, giving financial flexibility for a building or something that we have to use right away, maybe a specific situation, I could consider a temporary one. In general, I think we should be trying to save more, and I think that's all of our goals, right? Like, we'd love to see these increase over time, and so I love what Councilor Hartmeyer-Prigg said. Like, if we do that, it would have to come with a time stamp for me. Like, this is fiscal year 25 and 26, 27, it's back to 11% or whatever. So I think I could be convinced there, but it's going to take a little bit more than we have right now. A couple other general comments. When we think about rising costs, I think about healthcare and I think about PERS, and these are out of our control, right? And I think one of the things that I need is a storyteller to our community is like, do we have a strategy here? And I know that we can't control the strategy ourselves. We cannot implement some of these things, but we can react to them, and we can talk about them, and we can figure some things out long term. I would really like to see us begin that conversation around a strategy on what are we going to do for healthcare and PERS, And again, knowing full well that we just get a bill on these things, and for some of them, but I think a strategy, or at least a conversation in that direction would help me. I also think about future costs within the Cooper Mountain area that will be developed, and what strategies we can do to possibly start thinking about containing cost growth out there. I think would help me as a storyteller, because that's going to be a big area of city, of new Beaverton, right? Like that's by far the majority of the development, and I don't want to be having this conversation 4 years from now because we weren't thinking about that right now, right? Like that's going to be a big area. So if we could start those conversations around the strategies, how are we thinking about, and I know that parts of those conversations have already happened with like public works and building new facilities and locating it in different areas and stuff like that. I think I want more of that. Like I think those are really good and really helpful for us as to do our job, which is to really work with and educate and tell the story to the public. But that's all I had.
Councilor Hartmeyer-Prigg.
Thank you. I agree with the majority of what my colleagues have said. I get nervous about a franchise fee increase because those are typically locally owned and operated. So I would want to just be careful that, like, I don't know enough about a franchise fee, but if it has a local impact, I would want us to be really careful. The TLT one is really interesting, but knowing we can only use 30% of it, I'm curious, would the extra then go towards paying off the bond faster? Is that what we would do with?
We could use it for things that are related to tourist promotion, and so,
Oh, arts. Okay, thank you. I do know that, I think it was maybe considered in the last legislative session, but to make some changes around TLT, right, is something that we want to have happen. And so I think it's a smart move for us to really think about this, and in the hopes that we have more control, right, of this in the future. So, I also like that. I think that it makes a lot of sense to say, hey, it's not just Beaverton residents bearing this burden. So I really appreciate that part of because we are looking at like lots of ways of raising revenue. I'm also in the boat of, I think we need to look at the levy and the fee to find a balance between those two things, especially because one, we have a bit more assurances of that coming in because it's within our control. And I also like that there's some flexibility there, right? And so just depending on how the will of the voters goes, if we needed to adjust, we have the ability to adjust. So I do think it's important for us to look at both. I know it's in the long term, but I think it's a great idea, that insurance pooling, right? Any of those and I think Councilor Hussing, you brought up something that Councilor Kirby brought up last time, right? Of like, where do we kind of pool different services as best we can? And I also agree that the services assessment, service prioritization, I think it's really critical that we look at what we do that is above and beyond. And I know it's really hard because I think the above and beyond things are a lot of what makes Beaverton so special. And so it's really hard to think about certain things and maybe not be listed as our core services. But I think we're just really at that point that we have to get really specific and clear on what are the services that we must fund as a city, and kind of use that as that baseline of what's above the line, what's below the line.
Councilor Kimmy.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Mayor. What are our chances of changing Measure 5 and 50?
Easy, 0.
0, right? So it's not happening. So we're going to have a structural deficit going forward for sure. I like levy and fee just for stability plus the flexibility to catch up with the inflation. When you talk about fee, are you talking about transportation fee plus the public safety fee that might be coming? What do you mean by fee exactly?
For the purposes of the conversation today, when we're talking about local option levy and monthly fee, we're talking about a potential public safety fee or city operations fee, an additional tool to address the city's deficit. But as I mentioned on that one slide, keep in mind that discussions are still ongoing around the transportation utility fee. So that's an ongoing discussion for council as well.
Right. It would make me comfortable if I would know at least the ballpark or exact number of how much do we have to raise to meet our obligations and pay our expenses. Because ideally, last time I thought when transportation came along, it was like close to like $30. And if you add public safety and on top of another fee, you're looking at pretty high number per month for residents to pay. So unless I have a basic, somewhat close to the number that we need, it's going to be hard to approve any increase in fee or anything, because I need to see the whole number. If we just ask, okay, let's go add levy and fee without knowing exactly how much we need, it might be impacting the residents over $50 a month. So we need to find out how much our residents are willing to pay an increase per month. So that is crucial for me to make decision on. But I am for levy and fee. But we have a structural deficit, and is there, what are your pathway to get a permanent fix on this? Any idea?
Well, Councilor Kimmy, I'll address kind of your other comment about we need to kind of figure out exactly what we need and what our deficit is, and that is something that our finance team will be working on, is really refining our 5-year forecast. We do have property tax data coming in November, so in the coming months we'll have a better idea of exactly what our deficit is, and then today we're really just trying to figure out what are the revenue tools that we want to move forward with, and then we'll come back with more precise cost estimates on those going forward. And then in terms of, a permanent fix, I'm not sure that anybody has figured that out here in the state of Oregon yet, but we're kind of starting with the foundation here of really kind of addressing what tools we want to start with. And so I don't know that any city really has a magic solution to that at this moment in time.
Okay, the reason behind that question is we know there's Measure 5 and 50 we're never going to fix. So then we have to catch up with the inflation. If we build in some kind of system in our budgeting where with the fee or somewhat of a tool that we can address those deficits ongoing, and that was the, I guess, basis of my question. That's it for now. Thank you.
Yeah, please. That's done, but go on.
Okay, I've got one final quick comment. Councilor Kimmy was just mentioning long-term fixes, and I know it is very difficult, given the situation we're working in, to get any long-term fix. But one of the benefits from fees that we didn't talk about too much tonight is the ability to index them to inflation. And so, Councilor Kimmy, to your point, and some of our long-term planning, like that is one of the real benefits of going that direction, is that we can build that in so we don't have to have a drastic increase 5 or 10 years down the road when we suddenly are falling way short. But I think fees that are indexed appropriately can help with some of that. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that in the future.
And the fee isn't a 5-year cap, so I think, I won't be here in 5 years when you guys have to do this again, so good luck. I will do my part now, and a future mayor will have to absorb that responsibility of renewing the bond in 5 years. I will say I think renewal is much easier than passing. I do want to have a couple words about a franchise fee. As one of the city councilors that instituted a franchise fee, trust me, people had very emotional opinions about it, and we were in a 8-year lawsuit with telecoms over our franchise fee adjustment. So it did not come It was not an easy fee to initiate for us, and I will tell you, when we initiated it, it was the council's legislative intent for it to be spent on roads. And we don't really do that now. And we had to, what we told voters and why we were doing it, and we told the community over and over again, people cut into the infrastructure and it damages it, and we need to be able to fix it. Right on my road, 155th this week, they are putting in a fiber optic line, and they jacked up a road that's in really great operating condition before some new utility is putting in something to address a handful of people, and all of us taxpayers pay it. So the reason we initiated that fee initially was to address the roads. Now it's being used in a plethora of ways, and we approved it. It's not like we didn't do it, but when we institute fees and communities absorb it, we tell them why we're doing it. And so if we're going to raise utility fees, we need to be able to be pretty clear on what we're spending it on. And I think sending it in other areas of the general fund is going to be a hard pill for people to swallow. And if you look at the bills, a lot of them say City of Beaverton fee. And so I agree the franchise fee can probably be adjusted a little bit, but that is not smashing the easy button. You will see some very angry people that have landlines coming in here to get you. And we know that we just completed the lawsuit not too long ago about what they were paying, and they will sue us again. So it will come with costs, and it will come with that. TLT, I would love to adjust it. I don't know what our cap is. There's a reason why we set it at what we did, and I just can't remember the exact reason. Do you know? You were around when we set it. Was there a cap?
There's not a cap.
There's not a cap? Okay. So I do think some adjustment to that makes a lot of sense. We're having a pretty good night head in bed compared to our cities around us right now, because I think people really generally like our community and the safety that it offers. And I've never once in my entire life booked a hotel and thought, I wonder what the local taxes are as I'm doing this. So that's an easy fee, I think, to adjust. And because we had long envisioned the TLT supporting arts, and that is totally absorbed in our general fund right now. So this would be a good way for us to kind of peel off and look at what we just went through in the last budget cycle, saving the arts manager position. We know it's an important piece for the community, and this would be a way for us to live our commitment to art and kind of safeguard it moving forward, would be to do that. So I'm very much supportive of that. I think we have to approach a levy and a fee. For us to generate the amount of revenue to just keep us even, I don't know if voters would pass. We're talking $80 to $1 per thousand to be able to catch up to where we are. And that's challenging. I think we also have to go in May, otherwise we're cutting $10 to $13 million. And we could adjust the reserves a little bit, but we have to pay the reserves back at some point too. Like, we're borrowing from ourselves, not creating free revenue. So if we bridge loan ourselves for 3 years to do that, how are we going to have to be very disciplined in paying it back? And that has to be accounted for when we're trying to operate in the levy. I think the sequential pace in which we do a levy and a fee has to be very strategic. If we go levy first, then it fails, and then go, just kidding, fee, I imagine the pitchforks that are going to be coming for us. So we need to do them in parallel, or go fee then levy. Because I think it would seem very disingenuous, even though us in this room understands, people don't pay attention to our daily actions until they start seeing things. And if they feel like we're trying to get over on them, that's going to be challenging. I also understand the need and desire to have a low-income tax program, and we did that with garbage, and it caused everyone else's rates to go up. So think about if we're going to go into a fee structure saying we're going to automatically exclude low-income people, we're going to end up having to have a much higher fee to actually generate the amount of revenue we need. So those are just things that are challenging, and we don't do that with property taxes. So how we might adjust those two things or reconcile with ourselves, we might not be able to live that value here and get what we need. So and the other, I want to make sure that we circle back on Councilor Husson's point about the courts, because I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't a cost drag on the city. And so I think the council needs to see a long-term how our decision-making has impacted the court's financiability. Us trying to address things and make it right, like not collect property or not collect ticket revenue, really drove the court in a different direction. When we agreed to not have the photo radar vans because the police managed it and it made their budget easier, but the court got the revenue, that's part of the reason the court's having a revenue issue right now. And so I think we need to, and the city manager and I talked about this, I think a week or two ago of scheduling it, we have to see how our own impacting decision-making makes some of these financial decisions, because a municipal court, considering this is a council full of Democrats that are very social justice oriented, is really one of the only tools we have to impact the mental health court, the DUI court, and some of these other services that we do. So I do think we need to look at it in its totality with the idea that it should be as cost revenue neutral as possible, because it used to not just be cost revenue neutral, it used to produce revenue. And so we have gone the opposite direction. So I think looking at that, but I don't think it's going to be a place where we're going to cut. If we cut it right now, there's going to be cost associated to the city. Our officers will have to go to Hillsborough to service our community. So I think that's a piece. I am interested from the council perspective on having some kind of, me, Councilor Duggar, and Councilor Husson went through this whiteboard exercise around what things we were going to do, and all three of us had different ideas on what were essential city services based on our own lived experience and value. And so I would be happy to do that again from the council, but what I think it would serve is it would serve as a tool that the city manager could reduce fees from. And I want to take that conversation a little bit separately from this, because we're trying to create and maintain the services we have. That feels like the next step, but that would be her blueprint on cuts. If we end up not having a levy, not having a fee, and we're into 10 to 13 million this year and then 10 to 13 million, she's going to have to start. There's no more underfilling vacancies, or are like those times are beyond us. We're at the bone now. So if she needs a blueprint on which limb to chop off, that's where I think that exercise would be helpful, from my opinion. But given the next 3-month window to get something going, the number one important thing for me is, what is the right mixture of fee and levy? How do we move forward so we could, in January, February, make a decision to refer this to voters? And we have to do a massive communication outreach to our community right now. And I sound like a broken record, but it's to dictate so they understand the value of the city. Because I think most people really like living here. Most people really like the cleanliness. They really like feeling safe. They really like a lot of those things, but they don't understand how their feeling is connected to the services we provide, because we don't tell them. And so we have to ramp up communication. And just as a reminder, when it goes to a levy, the second we refer it, it is council's responsibility to get it over the line. So yes, there are people on the ballot. That means the other 4 of us are going to have a little bit more work. You're going to have to work this into your talking points and why you're running for re-election. And this is going to take all of us. Having worked on the police bond that failed and the police bond that succeeded, it is a lot of work. It is not like running a campaign for re-election. It is 10 times worse and harder. And you have to raise money for it at the same time. So this is something we all have to go into together as a council. And I think it's one of the few times that I would like our council to move forward with some degree of unison, so our community hears from us how important this is. And I've rarely asked the council to move forward in unison on anything, because I think we all bring different perspectives. So what I think you heard today, just to recap what I think I heard from my colleagues, they're interested in looking at a blend of fee and levy, understanding how much money we need to do. I think in the fee, what's interesting to me from the fee perspective is we do have we have a lot of nonprofits, we have a lot of government entities that don't pay. They would be in the mix to pay this versus the property tax increase. So how do we get a better idea of what those are? And we saw that a little bit in the transportation fee methodology. And so I think we need a little bit of work to better understand what that number would actually produce. Because when I look at these numbers compared to what we just heard from Tim a few weeks ago, the math doesn't math for me in the outcome. So he's over there like, yeah, I get that. So we need to have an understanding to that. And I would just say, just a few weeks ago, this council was really... And I cautioned us, we're like, okay, you want to move forward with a $20 utility fee, like these other fees are coming in a couple weeks. And so My personal perspective is a bit of a split, a $10 transportation, $10 utility, kind of split the, how we're going to implement and move things around. I do not think in any stretch of the way that we could do a $20 road utility fee and a $20 service fee. I just think that would lead us to a really bad situation where I think people would be very upset. But that is my perspective. I'm one of 7, so I think a good set of numbers would help us make that decision. And we need to think about what the timeline of the next few months looks like. We're meeting once in December, then we have our council retreat. Like, what information and at what pace? We're probably going to have an extra meeting. We're going to have to commit to moving this forward, and it's going to have to be isolated, and we're going to have to commit to having some extra meetings to get you guys the information you need. And I would take today, write down all your questions, go back to the city manager so she can compile these and make sure we're getting everything answered, because we have about 3 months. That's it. So, Councilor Husson?
Yeah, I hear that there's a majority that's probably not what I had said on the record, which is fine. But I also hear you, Mayor, that you want us to move in unison. So I think I want to say this. A lot of people in our community right now aren't calling the police because of what's happening. And I acknowledge that this is related but unrelated. But to ask me to support a levy and not have the conversation when I'm begging people in my community to call the police is very complicated. So I need to name that, because I'm asking folks to report the things that they don't even want to report. And so that's just like where I live right now. And so that's why I need more to feel comfortable. And I would be remiss if I didn't make sure that you all heard that, because that is very much kind of the world that I live in. And so if I have to get behind a levy because this is the pleasure of the council, that is what I need. I don't think I've said anything that you haven't heard in the past from me in the last 4 to 5 years. So it's really important, especially now when we had 2-3 broken car windows by most likely Department of Human Services of constituents that live in our community. So their cars were broken to take them, and they don't want to call the police. And I'm like, you gotta call the police. Like, at least report the thing, right? So that's just where I'm living in this moment. And if I didn't at least express that for you all to hear, to understand, then I just think I'd be remiss to not mention that. So I want to move, obviously, with you all, and I need to be really honest about where I'm sitting right now, too. So thank you.
I hear that, and what I would hope is you could meet with the city manager and go into detail what you need, because complete system reform of the police is not going to match this timeline. And I understand your vote's going to be contingent on that, and I want to be honest that I believe what you're saying and I believe to move forward. I don't know if we could do both of those at the same time. I'm willing to meet with you and have a conversation with the city manager to see what kind of information we could produce to make sure you have whatever you make. I'm not going to beholden you to make a decision, but I want you to have the information you need to make a yes or no decision. I will 100% to commit to that. Whatever you need to move this forward, and I will work with the city manager to get it. But I need to understand a little bit more in depth of what you'd like to see, and I'd be happy to help facilitate that. Anything else? All right, this is like the worst part of being an elected. They talk about 2 things, like policy and budget being your 2 main jobs. I only like to focus on the policy because it's the fun part. This part sucks. So, and I'm so glad that, Elizabeth, you left your other city to do years of fiscal recovery to come to a city where you probably presumed the problems didn't exist, to jump right back in. I also my closing comments of why I've been so fierce about the library and working with on our behalf is, the library is facing a $2 million deficit. It is a big chunk of this deficit that we're facing today, and that revenue is being collected from our taxpayers by our community for their likely assumption that it's going to go to Beaverton. And so this is part of what's been challenging and hard, and why Elizabeth and I have been going to the mat with the county. This is not 10 years ago where we had so much money we could do everything. Every bit counts. And why I think, from THPRD's perspective, why I was so challenging for them to convince me on Cooper Mountain because a 30-acre expansion takes all of that off the tax revenue for us forever, for a regional asset that people outside Beaverton will be enjoying. And I am a heavy utilizer of Cooper Mountain, and I love it there. But those are the decisions this council, every time we make a decision like that, this is leading to where we're at. And so we play a big piece in kind of the situation we're in now too. And I would like to at some point have a larger discussion about what's hard for us when we're making policy decisions is they're one-off, and we don't see how it's impacting the larger scheme of it. And so I don't know how to fix that. I don't know any mayor that's been able to solve that issue, but I think that that piece is constantly the teetering point for us of when we make a decision, it impacts the budget, but we don't really understand how it impacts the budget till years later. So with that, we'll have our last agenda item, council new business. If anyone has any more fun things to add to today's conversation, I'm here to hear it. All right, we stunned them to silence. With that, we're adjourned.